these are such crucial distinctions and crucial contextual history that I think people are still learning to this day. And I really love what you said about China building socialism. That's also extremely important. And the distinction of China and how the state controls the capital. That is something that the world desperately needs, the US desperately needs, but is quite the opposite at the moment. So I guess I wanted to ask you both, in experiencing the building of socialism, as you spent time in China. Carl, I wanted to ask you, as a child, growing up in China, being in China, I love hearing your stories about how you were born here, you grew up here, and you said that you had a really wonderful youth. I'd love to hear more about that, about how you witnessed the building of socialism just through a very personal lens as you were growing up.
Well, I mean, we can just compare the healthcare system between China and United States, because we all know the American healthcare system is seriously broken. When I was about 11 or 12, I contracted hepatitis A and I was hospitalized. I had to stay in the hospital for I think a month, and all that was done and paid for by the state because I was staying with my grandma, because my grandma was work as a school teacher, and the factory to which her school teacher attached had its own hospital system. So, and they offered healthcare to all the families of the factory workers. I stayed in the hospital for a month at no charge, and that's unthinkable in US today. And look, a lot of the propaganda against China is actually serve to convince you not to look to China as a model, as a viable model, because people will say, oh, China is just as bad. China is just like another imperialist country, or China is just as bad as United States. It couldn't be further from the truth. Like Radhika has said, capital do not control. There hasn't been a taking over of the state by the capital. And in China, the party is very much in control. I'll give you an example. When Obama talked to Steve Jobs about shifting maybe some of the production of Apple iPhone back to the United States, Steve Jobs just said, no, can't be done. Can you imagine if Xi Jinping went to talk to Jack Ma and says, hey, how about have more more localized production in China? And Jack Ma just like, no, not gonna do it. I mean, that just doesn't happen. This is a very easy example. And another example is infrastructure. Like China has built a high-speed rail and to every corner of the country, and they have very excellent 5G network now. Now you can go to hiking in the mountains, go to the Himalayan foothill. You have excellent coverage. I lived in Los Angeles for many years. There's many parts of Los Angeles you still get dead zones, right? I mean, Los Angeles is only the second largest city in the United States. And this is the reason is because in US, everything is profit driven. There's not enough return on capital to justify the investment in rural infrastructure, apparently, and to serve the people who live in the remote part of the country. And this is why you will see Wall Street Journal articles criticizing China's high-speed rail system. They're saying, oh, China is building all these trunk lines out to the middle of nowhere in Tibet, in the Gobi Desert. They're never going to get return on their investment. But there's a fundamental misunderstanding. The infrastructure is not a profit-making enterprise. It's to serve public goods. And actually, by serving public goods, you actually facilitated economic exchange. The whole reason of infrastructure is really the government that taking charge of public infrastructure precisely is because these things should not be turn into private enterprises to squeeze out every penny from consumers. And these are the very obvious differences between China and United States. A lot of people just didn't know where to look because maybe they're not familiar with China. They don't have the proper context to understand it. But in China, the difference is they still have those poverty alleviation trains where they maintain like a train line that goes to very remote mountainous area that allow the farmers there to take their local produce, including goats and sheep, to get on the train so they can reach the market, and they keep the fare unchanged for 30 years so local people can also profit from the economy. That kind of thing would not exist in United States.
Yeah, I love every single example that you brought to the table. I mean, about Jack Ma, about healthcare in your childhood, especially in an era that was quite different to what it is now, right? In terms of China's economic stability. And then on top of that, my favorite is the high-speed rail. I mean, I travel through China through high-speed rail all the time. And like you said, I'm not just traveling to the other big cities. It's not just connecting the big urban center to another big urban economic center. It's like I can go to the most far out rural region, which is connected directly to Shanghai. You know, I don't have to switch trains. I can just go straight there to a farm. I can go straight there to a rural region in China that I've always wanted to see. And not only does that connect me to these people, but it connects these people to other metropolitans and other farms and all these different areas. So rural populations are not marginalized and they're not isolated. Whereas as I spent time in the West, in Australia, in the US, rural populations are completely isolated. They're just like totally cut off from the societies in all these different cities. So that, for one, like you said, is a people-centered, public goods-driven facility. But I think the Wall Street Journal has no idea what that even means, what a people-centered public goods even could be, you know, as it's being critiqued for not being profit-driven. Really, really love these examples that you brought up. Radhika, I'd like to hear about you, you know, as someone who's traveled to China so much, how have you experienced socialism in action?
You guys used the example of a high-speed train. I don't particularly have experience of the Chinese healthcare system or anything, but thankfully, nor do I have the experience of the American healthcare system because I've lived in Canada a lot. And Canada has a publicly provided healthcare system, although it's being excoriated by neoliberal policies and so on. But yeah, I think infrastructure is definitely a key issue. I think the expansion of higher education in China that has taken place over the last couple of decades has been enormous. And I think it's bound to have a huge impact on China. So I would say that that's another thing. Yet another thing is that, you know, in the process of, you know, we talk about Chinese socialism, and I think one of the things about the party state in China is, you know, it's not that the party state has always got everything right. But I think what's interesting about the party is that it learns. It has a mechanism of learning. And I think that what, you know, between sort of coming here often and reading and so on, first of all, I think what's impressed me is that the sheer range, width of the political spectrum is much greater. In China, you have liberals duking it out with socialists and then policies, you know, neoliberals versus socialists, and everybody has their say and then policy is decided. And I think that has actually been quite revealing to me. I think that often my Western colleagues are very curious about what I experience in China. And I say, actually, all sorts of things are said in China that you'd think should not be said. But actually, in China, as I say, different options are considered and then given option may be chosen or a set of options may be chosen. So I think that whereas in the West, you can't be a socialist at all. So it's all like the political spectrum is this narrow, whereas in China, it's this wide. So that's another thing that I find really interesting. I think also that the new emphasis, you know, I think that, you know, so the reason I started talking about how the party learns is that I think in the process of reform and opening up and in the expansion of higher education, there was a time when I think that there was a brief period of time when in the education system, with which I have some experience, was as if, you know, like they were swallowing neoclassical economics and Western style social science whole, you know, no longer need to talk about Marx, you only need to talk about Max Weber and Paul Samuelson and, you know, neoclassical economics and so on. And this is now changing with a new emphasis on Marxism. And I think that's good. And I feel that what I'm also seeing here in China is that not only is Marx was mainly a critic of capitalism, but this critique is also being used to develop the theory of socialism. And I think that's been really interesting to me as well. And for the rest, I mean, I just want to say about, you know, since we are talking so much about infrastructure, in Western countries, infrastructure has become a big boondoggle in many ways. So first of all, when infrastructure is to be built, essentially building infrastructure means that governments give guaranteed cost plus huge profit, very lucrative contracts to corporations. The accountability is very low, so they may be, not built on time. Like, there are so many scandalous instances of cost overruns that go into absolutely like 2 or 3 times the original cost and so on. So that way big corporations simply milk the state for money. Whereas here, even though there are private corporations that may be building infrastructure, they are accountable. You promise to deliver this, you must deliver this, only then you get paid, etc. Secondly, privatization. The privatization of key natural monopolies, water provision, electricity provision, railways, etc. has meant that private capitalists have been minting money, making money out of things that people can't do without. So I was reading in a Financial Times column of all places that, this fabled American consumer no longer exists, because if you actually look at what the things, overwhelming majority of the money earned by an average American individual is spent on things you can't help spending money on. You've got to pay your rent or your mortgage. You've got to pay your utilities. You've got to pay back your loans. You've got to pay for your phone, etc. And once all of this is paid for, which is now increasingly paid to private corporations, there's nothing left over. So there we go. So in that sense, I think that the experience of China and people in China is very different.
Absolutely.
偷偷告诉大家，我最近发现了新法宝 Royal Face 逆时奇迹系列，它有活肤露、全效精华，还有精华霜。尤其我皮肤比较偏干，所以我非常的注重保湿。保湿做得好，肌肤自然烹饪。提亮肤色更年轻，抚平皱纹超有感，而且气色变好，用心保养，每天都更美一点。美吧！